Hi, I'm Ajit Lenin. Welcome to part two of the video series on enterprise architecture. In the part one, I introduced the 6-layer framework that will help us to define and establish an enterprise architecture practices, right? So in this part, we will briefly look at each of these layers, right? So each of these layers, which is repository layer, artifacts, architecture domains, breadth and depth, evolution, and usage, right? So each of these layer will help us make some decisions that will help us establish and define enterprise practices in the organization, right? So each of these layer on the top layers contribute towards the requirement. The decisions we make on each of the layers will contribute towards making decisions on the lower layers, right? So we'll quickly look at a brief on each of these layers. So we'll start from the bottom. We'll start with the repository layer. Right? So what is a repository layer, right? The repository layer basically defines the repository, represents a physical repository where all the components of enterprise architecture goes, right? So when I say components, it could be any object that is part of the defined or managed within the enterprise architecture. This could be business entities, a relationship between them, business processes, functions, whatever we want to define in the enterprise architecture, right? And it also holds all the metadata that would drive the process, right? Drive the enterprise architecture practices, governance process, what type of artifacts we're going to manage, what is the life cycle of the artifact. So all those metadata also will be part of this repository. And also will be the part of this repository would be the actual diagrams, right? This would be the views we want to present to the users of this enterprise architecture, right? So all those goes into this repository, and this repository also have those tools to manage these components, right? Whether it could be a UI to manage these components, the drawing tools or whatever it is, right? And also a set of APIs that can help us manage these components as well. And this repository can be built using any technology standards that organization is using, or it could be any established EAM, enterprise architecture management tools in the market would be able to give us the capabilities that a typical repository needs, right? The other aspects apart from the components in the repository is the KPI injection, which we can talk about in detail when we go to a higher layer where we say define the KPIs. But primarily, this is for the defined KPIs. How are we going to integrate with our ecosystem, the production systems to gather data so that we can measure the KPIs, right? So that could be an important aspect in the repository. And also the integrations. So how are we going to integrate this repository with the enterprise ecosystem, right? This could be project management tools, could be Jira, or the collaboration tools like Confluence, or the HR tools, or the ticketing systems in the organization, right? So to have an effective enterprise architecture practice, we need to integrate them with these tools so that it can be automated, right? Rather than this becomes a standalone tool, this has to be integrated with enterprise ecosystem, right? So that's a brief on repository layer. We'll see it on more detail in the subsequent videos. So let's move to the next higher level, right? That's the artifacts layer, right? So on the artifacts layer, this is where we're going to make decisions on what all the artifact types we're going to use to represent the enterprise architecture or the components of the enterprise architecture, right? It could be catalog. So I have basically defined the artifact types into 4, right? It could be catalogs. These are basically list of objects and their definitions, right? That are managed in the enterprise architecture. This could be a list of applications, list of processes, list of business functions, right? Whatever objects it is, we need to have the catalog of that, right? And the second artifact type is the matrix. So let's take an example of business processes, right? So we need to have a matrix that would represent business processes versus the business functions that process invokes, right? That could be one matrix. The other matrix could be the application to business function. So we need to be able to map the applications, which is part of the IT ecosystem, with the business functions that application is supporting, right? Similarly, the next one is flows. So flows could be anything that represents a flow of control or data or information, right? So it could be simple flow chart, it could be a value stream diagram, it could be an interaction diagram or a sequence diagram, whatever it is. Those all comes under the flows, right? And models are the models that represent the structure of a component, right? It could be an entity model, right? It is a data model or a process model, whatever it is, but which is defining the structure of an object, right? And so while we manage, while we define these artifact types, there are a couple of other behavioral aspects I want to bring in is the notations, right? So this is where we should make a decision on what type of notations are we going to use in the enterprise architecture. It could be Archimate, UML, BPM, and depends on the standards the organization want to follow. We can make the decision on what notations we want to support. And the other aspect is the hierarchy. So when we define all these artifact types, each of these artifact type represents object in different levels of the hierarchy, which we'll talk in brief on the when we talk about breadth and depth. But this layer we need to make decisions on how are we going to, on what hierarchy level, what type of artifacts are applicable, and how are we going to maintain the relationships. Right? With that, we'll move to the next higher level, which is the architecture domains layer, right? So this is a layer where I'm directly adopting it from the TOGAF. So there are 4 domains that TOGAF defines, right? So business architecture is one domain, so which basically captures all the aspects of a business, right? It could be business process, functions, business entities, right? So anything that pertaining to the business. Information architecture is how are we going to, what is managing the information model itself, right? It could be the higher level information model or the data model. So it goes into the information architecture. The application architecture gives us this application landscape and also gets into the details of the application. And the technology architecture manages the technology landscape, how each applications are using these technologies, right? It could be database technologies, web servers, message queues, whatever it is, and also the front-end technologies, what we want to use, right? So all these technology aspects goes into the technology architecture. And while we define all these components or the objects that we want to manage within the enterprise architecture for each of these domain, we need to have a mapping. So how a business object, an object defined on the business architecture, how does it map to the an object defined in the information architecture, right? So a business entity in the business, how is it represented on an information model, right? So all those mappings also should be part of this layer. And also another important aspect is the patterns. So when I say patterns, these are architectural styles and patterns that we adopt from the outside world or something that we can internally develop. Plus, it also represents what TOGAF defines as architecture building blocks or the solution building blocks, right? So we want to, though we may not be able to define them there, we just need to be able to define the strategy on how are we going to manage the patterns in this when we make the decisions on this layer, right? Moving further up on the breadth and depth. Okay. So the breadth and depth gives us an important, very important layer, which lets us define what is the breadth. When I say breadth, it is what defining the scope of the enterprise architecture, right? So what are the business segments that we want to represent in our enterprise architecture and represent and manage in our enterprise architecture, right? So while it's important to define the breadth of the enterprise, we need to be able to define the depth of the architecture also we want to, right? So when we break these segments down into sub-segments and further down to the level to which the business capabilities, right, that we want to manage within the enterprise architecture. So the depth, both the depth and breadth depends on the organization, how we want to organize it, but we need to have a clear definition of it. So this layer gives us an opportunity to define and make decisions on how we want to break down the organization along the breadth and depth, right? So important components of this layer are segments, right? Whether logical or physical partitions of the business, however we want to organize the enterprise architecture, and the capabilities, right? The lower level, what business capabilities are we going to manage, right? And also, when we define the business capabilities, we need to have the corresponding IT capabilities also that enable that business capabilities, right? Both has to be represented within the capabilities. Then the two important part of this layer would be defining the vision. So at an organization or enterprise level, or at each segment level, what is the vision, right? So that would define that would be driving all our architecture decisions going forward, right? So the vision and the architecture principles, right? What are the guiding principles we want to take care to, we want to adhere to when we make the architecture decision? So all those are defined in this layer, right? And the behavioral aspects we need to look at on this layer is the traceability, right? So how are we going to trace? One is from the top towards the depth, across the depth of the organization, right? So from how it's a business entity or an object defined on the higher topmost segment maps down to the entities or the objects in the bottom level, right? So the whole that vendor traceability, and also it also should take care of the continuity across the segments, right? So that we are making sure that the segments we are covering is covering the breadth of the organization. We are not leaving any gaps, right? So that continuity also can be managed. As well as the other thing is for each of these segments or the subsegments, right? We should be able to define the KPIs. So whatever way organize, whatever KPIs and whatever way the KPIs need to be managed, we need to define at this layer. So this would define, give the requirements for the repository to see how do we integrate with the production systems to get the data for the KPIs. Right? So moving further up on the next layer is the evolution layer. So this is so we talked about breadth and depth, which are two dimensions of the enterprise architecture. The third dimension is the time dimension, right? So this layer lets us define the time sensitiveness of the enterprise architecture, right? So how we want to define the enterprise architecture, or what is our strategy towards evolution, right? Do we want to, how we want to keep the roadmaps, right? What are the ways we want to define the transition architectures? The blueprints, right? So which is a snapshot of the enterprise architecture, what all intervals we want to take the blueprints, right? And another important aspect is the standards. So what industry standards are we going to follow within are we going to follow or are we following in the organization, right? It could be on a telecommunications perspective, this could be TM Forum or a HIPAA standards for the medical fields, or it could be anything that deals with the US federal government. It has to be compliant with FISMA. So what are the FISMA standards to be followed? So all those aspects comes in. So the important aspect is, as those standards evolve, how is that impacting our enterprise architecture, right? So that's the primary thing why we want to capture what are the standards details here, right? So while we define that, the behavioral aspects we need to define here is, one is versioning. How are we going to version all these components of enterprise architecture? Could be at an object level or at an artifact level. How are we going to manage the versioning? And the very important aspect is, what is our change management process for the enterprise architecture, right? So this is where if an organization is following TUGAF, how are we going to tune the TUGAF, bring the architecture development method or the ADM from TUGAF and tune it for your organization, right? So this is where we're going to define what is the process of managing the architecture components, right? So this is an important layer, important set of decisions we need to make, right? Then finally, the topmost layer is the usage layer. So this is basically going to give the requirements for all the layers bottom down, right? So the primary aspect is to define who and how are we going to use the enterprise architecture or its components, right? So there are a couple of usage by default, which always we need to have as part of the enterprise architecture. One is the governance, right? So this layer should define the governance process, right? What all, how are we going to manage the governance? What all artifacts needs to be covered, etc. Right? And the second as usage of the enterprise architecture is the reference part of it. So an enterprise architecture by default becomes a reference component, right? For the community within the enterprise. It could be developer community, business community, whoever it is, right? So we need to define who's going to use it, but it is a reference knowledge database, right? So with that, which comes with the discovery aspects, how are we going to discover the components? What are the capabilities, etc. Right? The two other usage of the enterprise architecture, which we need to pick on how we're going to use is the strategy aspects. So how are we going to strategically use the enterprise architecture, right? So what business decisions how are we going to drive business decisions, and what all business decisions we want to drive from the enterprise architecture using enterprise architecture as a base, right? The second aspect is the project design aspect. So on an ongoing basis, how are we going to manage the changes in the enterprise itself, right? So it could be business process, it could be new products coming in, it could be compliance issue, changes, whatever it is. So when a project comes in, how are we going to use the enterprise architecture to help us design the project, right? So that's another important aspect. So we need to define in what all type of projects we're going to use and how are we going to use it, right? So all these usage aspects would define the stakeholders, right? Who are the stakeholders for this enterprise architecture? That means who are going to consume the enterprise architecture, meaning the artifacts or the diagrams, and who are going to contribute towards it, right? It could be enterprise architecture team, business team, developers, whoever it is, right? And for each of these stakeholders, what are the viewpoints they are interested in? So that viewpoints would define the views, and which will define what artifacts they are looking for, right? So to summarize, so we looked at in brief on the 6 layers, right? So each of this layer from bottom up, right, defines what are helps us make some key decisions that will define and help us establish the enterprise architecture practices. From top down, right, each layer, the decisions taken on each layer on the top would help us, will basically become a requirement towards the lower layers, right, and help us implement those decisions. So this is on a very high level I wanted to cover on this video. From the next video, we will get into the details of each layer, right? So we'll start top down so that we can, for each layer, how that decisions are going to drive the requirements to the bottom layer. So we'll start from the top. So the next video would be on the usage layer. Thank you.